Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's Notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil for yet another engaging conversation.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to explore American sovereignty by looking closely at two really pivotal moments.
That's right. We'll be comparing the Boston Tea Party back in 1773 with something much more recent.
Exactly. Liberation Day, which happened just a couple of weeks ago, April 2nd, 2025.
And it's important context, of course, that Donald Trump is currently president, serving his second term. Liberation Day represents actual policies being enacted right now.
Right. So our mission here is to compare these two events. We want to look at the motivations, the justifications people gave.
The symbolism involved, and naturally the consequences, both intended and unintended.
It's all about understanding how this idea of American sovereignty has maybe changed over time and, what it means for America's place in the world.
Which leads us to the big question for our listeners, really.
Does this Liberation Day echo that revolutionary spirit of 1773? Or does it signal something fundamentally different, a real shift in how America sees itself globally?
It's a fascinating comparison. Two assertions of sovereignty, but perhaps in starkly contrasting ways.
So let's start back in the 18th century. The Boston Tea Party. What's the background there?
Well, the key context is the period right after the French and Indian War, which ended in 1763. Britain was victorious, but had accumulated massive debt.
And that changed things for the colonies, right? Before that, Britain had practiced a kind of salutary neglect.
Largely, yes, a relatively hands-off approach. But post-war, facing that debt, British policy shifted dramatically towards more direct control and, crucially, revenue extraction from the American colonies.
And this wasn't just one law. It was a series of acts that really built up resentment.
Precisely. You had the Stamp Act in 1765 taxing printed materials. That's where we get the famous "no taxation without representation" slogan.
Which was repealed, but then came the Declaratory Act.
Yes, in 1766, Parliament basically doubled down, asserting its absolute right to legislate for the colonies, in all cases whatsoever. A very strong statement.
Followed by the Townshend Acts in 67, more taxes on imported goods.
Including tea. And while most of those Townshend duties were eventually repealed due to colonial boycotts, the tax on tea was deliberately kept.
Why just the tea tax?
As a symbol. It was meant to uphold that principle established by the Declaratory Act, Parliament's right to tax the colonies, whether the colonists consented or not. It became a real point of contention.
So this simmering resentment over taxation and representation sets the stage for the Tea Act of 1773.
Exactly. Now, the Tea Act itself was complex. Its stated purpose was actually to bail out the struggling British East India Company.
How so?
It allowed the company to ship tea directly to the colonies and sell it through its own agents, bypassing colonial merchants and potentially even lowering the price of tea for consumers, even with the Townshend tax included.
So cheaper tea sounds like a good deal. Why the uproar?
Because the colonists saw right through it. Or at least that's how they perceived it. It wasn't really about the price.
It was about the principle again.
Precisely. They saw it as a clever trick. A way to make colonists accept Parliament's right to tax them by enticing them with cheaper tea. If they bought the tea, they'd be implicitly accepting the tax and thus Parliament's authority.
A kind of trap to legitimize the tax.
That was the fear. And it wasn't just about abstract principles. It was also a direct hit on colonial economic interests.
Because it granted a monopoly.
Yes. The East India Company got a monopoly on tea sales, cutting out colonial merchants, many of whom were quite influential, figures like John Hancock, Samuel Adams. Their livelihoods were threatened.
And these figures were key in organizing the resistance.
Absolutely. They framed it as an assault on colonial liberty, both political and economic. Protests started happening in different ports, but Boston became the flashpoint.
Why Boston specifically?
Because the royal governor there, Thomas Hutchinson, was determined that the tea would be unloaded and the duty paid. He refused to allow the tea ships to leave the harbor without doing so.
Which led to a standoff.
A major standoff. It culminated on December 16, 1773. There was a large meeting at the Old South Meeting House. Thousands of people. Appeals to the governor failed. That evening, a group of men, maybe 100 or so associated with the Sons of Liberty, disguised themselves.
Famously as Mohawk Indians.
Right. They boarded the three ships, the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver, that were anchored at Griffin's Wharf.
And they destroyed the tea.
Systematically. Over several hours, they hoisted 342 chests of tea onto the decks, broke them open, and dumped the entire cargo into Boston Harbor.
A huge amount of property destroyed. What was the message they were sending?
It was incredibly symbolic. A direct attack on British property, yes, but more fundamentally on Parliament's authority to tax and regulate colonial trade through measures like the Tea Act monopoly.
And choosing tea was significant.
Highly significant. It was the very commodity representing the contested tax and the resented monopoly.
What about the disguise? Why the Mohawk identity?
That's debated by historians, but it likely symbolized a rejection of British identity, an assertion of a distinct, perhaps even Native American defiance. It distanced them from acting merely as Englishmen protesting. It was a performance.
One participant, Joshua Wyeth, famously described it as making so large a cup of tea for the fishes.
A memorable phrase, capturing the scale and the defiance.
But how was it received among the colonists themselves? Was everyone on board, so to speak?
Not universally, no. There was definitely division. Many patriots, like John Adams, celebrated immediately as a bold, necessary act of resistance.
Not others.
Others, including prominent figures like Benjamin Franklin and even George Washington initially, expressed serious concerns about the destruction of private property. They felt it went too far, that it was lawless.
So it wasn't instantly hailed as heroic by everyone?
No. It took effort by organizers like Samuel Adams to really frame the narrative. They successfully portrayed it as a justified defense of liberty against tyranny, downplaying the property destruction aspect.
And that narrative stuck.
It did. It became a foundational story, a key part of the mythology of the American Revolution, a symbol of popular action against oppression.
Okay, so what was the British reaction to having all that tea dumped in the harbor?
Predictably furious. They saw it as an outrageous act of vandalism and rebellion. The response was swift and punitive.
The coercive acts.
Known by the colonists as the Intolerable Acts, passed in 1774. There were several parts.
Like closing the port of Boston.
Yes, the Boston Port Act closed the harbor until the destroyed tea was paid for. A huge economic blow.
And they targeted Massachusetts government directly, too.
The Massachusetts Government Act severely restricted town meetings and increased the power of the royally appointed governor, effectively curtailing self-government.
There was also the Administration of Justice Act.
Right, which allowed British officials accused of crimes in the colonies to be tried elsewhere, likely Britain, where colonists feared they'd escape justice.
And an updated Quartering Act.
Making it easier for the British Army to house soldiers in colonial buildings. The clear intention was to punish Massachusetts, isolate it, and make an example of it.
But did it work? Did it isolate Massachusetts?
Quite the opposite, actually. It backfired spectacularly. The other colonies saw the Intolerable Acts not just as an attack on Massachusetts, but as a fundamental threat to their own rights and liberties.
If Parliament could do that to Massachusetts, they could do it to Virginia or Pennsylvania?
Precisely.
Yeah.
Instead of dividing the colonies, it galvanized them. There was an outpouring of support for Boston. Food, supplies, messages of solidarity.
And it led to more organized, unified action.
Absolutely. It was the direct impetus for the convening of the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in September 1774.
All colonies except Georgia sent delegates.
Right. And they took significant steps. They endorsed the Suffolk Resolves, which declared the Intolerable Acts unconstitutional.
They also established the Continental Association.
A coordinated boycott of British goods, a major escalation in economic resistance.
And crucially, they called for the colonies to form and train militias.
Preparing for potential armed conflict. So the Tea Party, intended as a protest against a specific tax and monopoly.
Ultimately served as a catalyst.
A crucial catalyst. It hardened positions on both sides, united the colonies in opposition, and pushed them much faster down the road towards declaring independence in 1776 and forming the United States.
A nation born from asserting sovereignty against an empire, which would eventually become a global power itself.
Indeed. A fascinating trajectory, starting with that act of defiance in Boston Harbor.
Okay, let's fast forward now. 252 years later to April 2nd, 2025, Liberation Day.
A very different setting. We're talking about policies enacted by the sitting U.S. President Donald Trump in his second term.
So not a popular uprising against an external power, but action by the U.S. government itself?
Exactly. And the core ideology driving these actions seems to be America first.
Which we heard a lot about in his first term and now seems central again. What does that mean in this context?
It generally translates to prioritizing national sovereignty, but defining sovereignty very much as unilateral freedom of action.
Freedom from constraints.
Freedom from the perceived constraints of international agreements, alliances, multilateral organizations. There's a deep skepticism of globalism.
And a more transactional view of international relations.
Very much so. judging relationships based on perceived direct, often economic benefits to the U.S. rather than shared values or long-term strategic partnerships.
And this isn't just rhetoric. There are policy frameworks behind this, like Project 2025.
Right. Project 2025, led by the Heritage Foundation, is a comprehensive plan developed during the interim period outlining a potential second Trump administration's agenda. It's quite detailed.
What does it recommend for foreign policy?
Well, it advocates for consolidating executive power, first off. But in foreign policy, it talks about potentially withdrawing from or significantly changing U.S. involvement in bodies like the World Health Organization.
Which the administration has now done.
Yes, and possibly NATO. It recommends major cuts to foreign aid through agencies like USAID.
Which we're also seeing reports of.
And it pushes for a much more confrontational stance, particularly towards China. A key theme is staffing the government with loyalists to ensure this agenda is implemented.
And we've seen other early actions in the second term aligning with that playbook.
Things like reinstating Schedule F to potentially remove certain civil service protections, dismantling diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. These actions suggest an alignment with the Project 2025 vision.
So Liberation Day itself, April 2nd, how does it function symbolically within this framework?
It seems positioned as a decisive break, a symbolic liberation from the perceived entanglements of the post-World War II international order.
An order the U.S. largely helped build.
Ironically, yes. It represents a rejection of multilateralism and global interdependence, framing them as burdens that limit American freedom.
Which is different from 1773. The colonists initially wanted rights within the British system before breaking away.
That's a key distinction. The 1773 revolutionaries were fighting for inclusion and representation first. The 2025 agenda seems focused on opting out of established international systems.
And a major part of this opting out on Liberation Day involves economic policy, specifically tariffs.
Yes, that seems to be a cornerstone. Building on first-term actions, but significantly escalating, there were reports of a new baseline tariff, maybe 10%, on most imports.
Effective soon after Liberation Day?
Right, maybe April 5th. And then even higher tariffs, called reciprocal tariffs, targeting countries with large trade surpluses with the U.S.
Like China.
China is definitely a prime target, with potential tariffs reaching incredibly high levels, maybe 145%. Also the EU, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan mentioned. These seem timed around April 9th.
Specific sectors getting hit hard too. Steel, aluminum, cars.
Those are often targeted, yes.
Yeah.
Steep levies are expected there.
What's the administration's rationale for such aggressive tariffs?
The justifications echo first-term arguments. Protecting American jobs and industries, fighting unfair trade practices like intellectual property theft or subsidies, especially from China.
Reducing the trade deficit is another goal?
Yes, along with encouraging companies to reshore, bring manufacturing back to the U.S., and bolstering national security by reducing reliance on foreign supply chains.
And they claim previous tariffs worked well. We saw those fictional White House communications suggesting minimal inflation impact.
Right. There's an official narrative claiming success and downplaying negative consequences. However, that runs counter to widespread warnings from economists and business groups.
What are their concerns?
Price hikes for consumers, major supply chain disruptions, damage to American exporters who face retaliation, and, well, retaliatory tariffs themselves.
And are we seeing that retaliation?
Reports indicate yes. Significant retaliatory tariffs are apparently being announced by China, maybe 125% on U.S. goods, and also by the European Union.
So the goal is strategic decoupling, especially with China, intentionally reducing economic ties.
That appears to be the explicit aim, using tariffs not just for trade balance, but as a geopolitical tool to fundamentally reorder global economic relationships and enhance U.S. autonomy, particularly in critical technologies.
It's a much broader use of tariffs than just protesting a specific tax on tea.
Absolutely. It's using economic levers to pursue large-scale geopolitical objectives.
Beyond trade, what about institutional retreat? You mentioned USAID.
Yes, reports suggest significant funding cuts and a dismantling of USAID, with its functions potentially being diminished or absorbed elsewhere.
And that's drawn criticism.
Bipartisan criticism, actually, from national security experts. They argue it severely damages U.S. influence, soft power, and credibility, leaving vacuums for rivals like China or Russia to fill.
What's the administration's counter-argument for cutting foreign aid?
Generally, that it's ineffective, wasteful, or doesn't directly serve core American interests, a very transactional view.
And alliances, NATO specifically.
Continued pressure there. Criticizing allies for not spending enough on defense, demanding increases well above the current 2% of GDP target, maybe even suggesting 5%.
And potentially tying U.S. security guarantees to that spending.
There's talk of making Article 5 commitments conditional on allies meeting these higher spending thresholds, maybe favoring those who pay more. It reflects that transactional view of NATO, sometimes described almost like a protection arrangement.
This aligns with Project 2025's call to transform NATO.
It seems consistent with that mindset, yes. Reassessing U.S. participation in these long-standing international structures.
Other examples of this institutional retreat.
Well, the withdrawal from the World Health Organization, pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement again, these fit the pattern.
And the justification always circles back to sovereignty.
Yes, restoring American sovereignty, defined as that unilateral freedom of action, the absence of external constraints imposed by treaties or international bodies.
Which is a very different view of sovereignty than the post-World War II approach.
Completely different. The post-war era saw the U.S. strategically use treaties and alliances, sometimes pooling or constraining its own sovereignty, to build collective security and prosperity.
Think NATO, the UN, the global trade system.
Exactly. The 2025 vision seems to see those very structures not as tools, but as impediments to national power. A stark contrast to 1773, where the goal was to become sovereign in order to form partnerships, not to withdraw from them.
So both moments hinge on freedom and independence, but the meaning seems to have shifted dramatically.
It really does. In 1773, freedom was deeply rooted in Enlightenment ideas, popular sovereignty.
The right of the people to govern themselves through consent. No taxation without representation.
It was about creation and assertion, not just rejecting British rule, but actively building new forms of republican government.
We saw that with the committees of correspondence, the continental congresses.
The state constitutions with bills of rights, the Articles of Confederation, and eventually the U.S. Constitution itself. Freedom in 1773 was largely a positive concept. The freedom to participate, to deliberate, to consent, to build a political order based on the people's will, collective self-determination.
Okay, contrast that with the vision of freedom in 2025, associated with Liberation Day.
Here, freedom seems primarily defined negatively, as freedom from
globalism, from alliances.
Freedom from perceived unfair economic competition, from the burdens of alliances, from the dictates of multilateral organizations.
And the policies reflect that. Tariffs, withdrawals.
Exactly. The actions are primarily acts of withdrawal, detachment, building walls, figuratively and perhaps literally. Tariffs, pulling out of the WHO and Paris Agreement, dismantling U.S. aid, questioning NATO.
So sovereignty in 2025 means unilateralism.
Largely, yes. The freedom to act based purely on perceived national interests without needing consensus, without being bound by international norms or laws.
And independence means minimizing ties.
Minimizing external obligations to maximize national autonomy, even if that leads toward isolation.
This also seems to reflect different takes on American exceptionalism.
Definitely. The 1773 view saw America as exceptional because of its founding principles: liberty, natural rights, popular sovereignty. A republic is a model, a city upon a hill.
An exceptionalism that eventually led to global leadership.
Right. The exceptionalism implied by Liberation Day 2025 feels different. It seems less about universal principles or leading an international order.
And more about
America's perceived right and power to simply stand apart, to prioritize its own interests narrowly defined, and maybe feel exempt from rules that apply to others. A rejection of those traditional global leadership responsibilities.
So a fundamental contrast. Freedom as the capacity for self-government and collective action versus freedom as the absence of external limits on national will.
A very profound difference in outlook, yes.
So let's talk consequences. The Boston Tea Party led, eventually, to a revolution and a new nation.
Yes. Its legacy, combined with Britain's reaction, was the American Revolution, the founding of the U.S., expansion, development, and ultimately global leadership after World War II, shaping the very international system we're discussing.
What about the potential trajectory stemming from Liberation Day 2025?
Well, the immediate risks seem significant. Those broad tariffs could easily spark wider trade wars.
We're already seeing retaliation from China and the EU.
Which impacts American exporters. We could see major supply chain disruptions, higher costs for everyone, potentially pushing the U.S. towards economic isolation.
And the approach to alliances like NATO.
That transactional view, questioning collective defense, it risks eroding trust, weakening partnerships. Allies might feel they need to hedge their bets, seek more autonomy, or even look to other powers.
And weakening USA.
Damages U.S. credibility and influence, especially in the developing world, potentially opening doors for rivals.
So the overall effect could be
a weakening of the U.S.-led international order, a shift towards a more fragmented, maybe unstable, multipolar world, strained relationships with allies, intensified confrontation with China, complex dealings with Russia.
How are other countries reacting?
Largely negatively among traditional partners, as you'd expect, confrontationally from rivals. Those retaliatory tariffs are a clear sign.
Allies must be deeply concerned.
Deep concern in Europe and Asia about NATO, about the global trading system. This could push them towards more independent regional cooperation, or maybe even a combination with powers like China.
And international organizations.
Likely further marginalized if the U.S. continues to disengage or actively undermine them. Adversaries might also feel emboldened by perceived U.S. retrenchment and divisions within the West.
It really feels like an inversion. 1773 led to building alliances and a U.S.-led order. 2025 seems to risk dismantling them.
That's a stark way to put it, but it captures the potential divergence in outcomes.
Let's consider the symbolism and how these events play in American political culture and memory.
Both are incredibly potent symbols, absolutely. They draw on national memory, but they also reshape it.
How so? Events get simplified into national myths.
Exactly. Complex historical moments often get boiled down into simpler narratives that convey core values and shape collective identity. The Boston Tea Party is a classic case.
It wasn't always just called the Tea Party, right? It was the destruction of the tea.
Right. And its transformation into this unambiguous symbol of heroic defiance against tyranny involved downplaying some complexities.
Like the economic motives of smugglers involved, or the fact that some elites initially condemned it.
Those details tend to fade. What remains is the powerful, easily accessible symbol of American liberty and popular resistance against oppression. It's been used by various groups throughout history.
So turning to Liberation Day, the name itself seems like a deliberate invocation of that history.
Highly deliberate, I would say. Using liberation taps directly into that revolutionary symbolism, the 1776 struggle against external control.
An attempt to legitimize today's policies by linking them to the founding.
It certainly appears that way. To frame economic nationalism and withdrawal as patriotic acts, casting global structures as somehow equivalent to the British Empire.
We've seen the Tea Party symbol appropriated before, by suffragists, the modern Tea Party movement.
Yes, historical symbols are constantly reappropriated. What's striking here is using liberation, a term associated with creation and freedom, to act to potentially justify isolation or withdrawal. Using revolutionary language for perhaps, arguably, regressive ends in terms of international engagement.
Both events also involved a kind of political theater, didn't they?
Very much so. The Boston Tea Party was inherently dramatic, the disguises, the clandestine nature, the public destruction, powerful visual symbolism defying the crown.
And Liberation Day, more modern political theater.
Likely relying on presidential announcements, the spectacle of signing executive orders controlling the media narrative, maybe rallies emphasizing national renewal and freedom from foreign constraints.
But the optics are different. Defiant action against the state in 1773.
Versus the state itself acting decisively from the top down in 2025. But both rely heavily on symbolic performance to convey meaning and rally support.
Okay, so bringing this all together, comparing these two moments reveals some really profound shifts.
Absolutely. Shifts in how America conceives of sovereignty, freedom, and its role in the world.
Let's summarize what was rejected and what was built in each case.
In 1773, the rejection was aimed at unaccountable imperial control taxation without consent, monopolies. The goal was self-government. What was ultimately built was a new republic that, over time, embraced global engagement.
And in 2025?
The rejection seems aimed at the perceived burdens of that post-war international order, multilateral agreements, economic interdependence, global leadership responsibilities. The aim seems to be building a more insular, nationally focused America via protectionism and disengagement.
The cost of sovereignty looks different, too.
In 1773, the cost was literally revolution lives, treasure, the immense challenge of nation building.
In 2025, the potential costs are different economic disruption, retaliation, lost influence, weakened security, global instability, perhaps.
And the perceived threat to sovereignty has changed. From external domination by an empire in 1773 to maybe the constraints of global interdependence itself in 2025.
So back to our central question, Liberation Day echo or antithesis of 1773?
Well, there's maybe a superficial echo in the act of asserting national will against perceived constraints.
But substantively?
Substantively, it looks more like an antithesis. 1773 led to creation, nation-building, eventual global engagement. 2025 seems to risk dismantling cooperation, strategic retreat.
And the vision of freedom differs. Positive creation in 1773, negative freedom from 1725.
Right. So Liberation Day might represent a kind of revolutionary impulse, asserting national prerogative, but directed towards potentially regressive ends, unraveling partnerships, stepping back from the global stage.
It's a fundamental challenge to that post-war American foreign policy consensus.
Using the spirit of 1773 to justify departing from the global role that 1773 ultimately made possible is quite a paradox.
Which leaves us with a final thought for our listeners.
Is Liberation Day a necessary course correction for America in today's world? Or is it a perilous misstep for the nation's identity and its place on the global stage?
A critical question indeed. That brings us to the end of this deep dive. Thank you for joining us as we compared the Boston Tea Party and the recent events of Liberation Day.
We hope exploring these contrasting visions of American sovereignty and freedom has been insightful.
Hopefully it prompts further reflection on what American freedom means today and what its implications are for the future.
There's certainly more to explore on topics like nationalism, global trade, and the complex history of American foreign policy.
As always, we value your thoughts and welcome any feedback or ideas for future deep dives. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.